Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to Highr's Summer of Learning and to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about something that is particularly close to my heart. And I'm extremely excited to be sharing today's space with two educators who feel just as strongly about what we're going to be talking about today as we do at Highr. So to those of you who are here for the first time, welcome to Highr. My name is Pallavi Devedi and I'm the founder of Highr, and Highr is a teacher professional learning organization. And over the last couple of months, we have been bringing you professional mentoring guidance in the form of workshops, webinars, live mentoring sessions, as well as all the fantastic discussion that keeps happening on our Facebook community and on our social media pages. We're very excited to be here with you all today to be talking about something which is perhaps one of the most crucial drivers to student learning. So without further ado, I'd like to get us started with talking about feedback and why feedback is so important. So I'm just going to quickly start sharing my screen and take you all through, first up, the housekeeping rules for today's webinar. In this webinar, the panelists will not be able to see you and will also not be using the raise your hand feature for this session. We request you to only use the Q&A option to ask your questions. This will help us find your question faster. It'll also help us respond to your question where the panelists can see the questions and respond and give you answers. We request you to keep all your observations, all your sharing, all of the things that you'd like to talk about within the chat. The chat is a very democratic and a healthy space for discussion. We do encourage you to use it as freely as you'd like, but at the same time, we'd also ask you to be discreet and be kind. Today's webinar and all of the proceedings, the recordings, the PPTs, everything that we talk about will be made available to all of you via email. We will be sending you a recording, as well as the presentations that we will share with you today will also be put up both on our YouTube page as well as on our website. So do check that out. Just a friendly reminder to those of you who might like to know, our webinars do not provide any certificates. We are an open learning event. We invite you to come in, to ask your friends to join in, to engage, to learn, to share, but we don't certify for attendance. So without further ado, I'd like to get us started with today's session. And to begin with, I'd like to introduce you to today's panelists. I'd first like to welcome Melanie Kong. Melanie is the founder or the co-founder of a fantastic tool called Floop. To those of you who have been a part of our workshops or who've been following us on social media, you know that we've been talking to you about Floop a lot. And today we have Melanie with us, who's going to be talking to us about Floop and what Floop does and the importance of feedback for Floop as a tool in your educator toolkit. The next person on our panel is Mrs. Sunanda Sandhir. Mrs. Sandhir is the principal for middle school at Pathway School, Noida. Is also a passionate educator, feels very strongly about feedback, and there's been lots of interesting discussions which Melanie, Mrs. Sandhir and I have had on feedback, and we're very excited to be sharing all of those discussions and all of our talking points with all of you. So to get us started with what we're going to be doing today, on the agenda for today is the research behind feedback, what feedback means in the classroom, what it means to us as educators, what it means for students, and what it means for student-directed learning and growth. What are some of the steps and strategies that we can put in place to better feedback to better the way in which we interact with feedback, the way in which we provide feedback, and the way in which we ask our students to read and consume that feedback. And very, very importantly, we also today will be talking about some tools that you can use to provide feedback to your students, especially when you're working remotely and online, and what some of those tools can add to your classroom practice as well. So to get us started with the discussion, I'm going to open this out to all of you in the audience, as well as to our panelists today. We're going to keep today's session very fluid, very conversational. We'll do lots of talking back and forth. It's not just going to be about presentations, because we all collectively believe that that feedback is something that we all need to talk more about. We don't talk enough about feedback. So which is why we'll talk about feedback today, and not just amongst ourselves, but also with all of you. So opening up this to our participants today who are listening to us, if you'd like to put in the chat box what you think feedback means to you as an educator, and what are some of the challenges that you have faced in your classrooms in giving and receiving feedback. If you could all just put into the chat your general sense of both of these questions. And I'll give you about a minute to put your responses in there. And then I'll open this out to both Melanie and Mrs. Highr and get their sense on what they think about feedback. And when you answer this question, both in terms of challenges as well as what it means to you as an educator, we'd like you to think a little bit about student achievement and how feedback you think might be connected with student achievement. So if we could just quickly take a look at your answers in the chat, and as these answers keep rolling in, we've got somebody who's saying that feedback helps you share with students how much they've learned. It also is a way in which teachers can help students improve their work, but it's a challenge to get students to actually read the feedback that's been provided and really act on it. And feedback is something also that that informs students about how they've done on a particular task, quite rightly so. Feedback is a bridge to success. That's a very interesting observation right there. And feedback is positive points and suggestions for improvement. It's how you feel about something, reviewing your own thoughts. Thank you for that, participants. Please keep these coming. Feedback is a reflection on a student's work. Interesting choice of words there, reflection on work. Checking, intervening on student responses. We also have letting students know about their strengths and also helping them identify their limitations. So some really interesting answers coming in there. I'd now like to open this out to you, Mrs. Highr. What, in your understanding, does feedback mean, and why is it important to us as educators?
So good afternoon to everybody, and I think there's some very nice answers coming over here, Pallavi. One of the ones I picked up was assessments, because for me feedback is about assessment and observation, and it is not only at the end, it's a part of the process which helps you. Specifically, feedback helps you to grow in whatever you're doing. It's not only a feedback from a teacher to a student. Even encouraging students to give feedback to you is also helps the teachers to grow. So feedback is essentially for me is observation, assessment of what we are doing, the process of what we are doing. For me, it means that.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Melanie, over to you. What do you think about feedback?
Absolutely. Same thing as Ms. Highr said. It is a process. That's the biggest thing that I feel about it. And I will be showing like a direct definition of how I see feedback later on in the presentation. But I think for me, the biggest shift in my understanding of feedback was from, I see a lot of responses around like, oh, it's the information that helps you improve, which is awesome and it's true. Yeah. But not only that, it's the way that you understand and make sense of that information and then use it to improve. So it's that process of understanding information and then growing from it.
That is so right. The process of understanding the information that is being shared with you. How often do we actually stop to see whether our students are really understanding the feedback that we're giving them? And what is it that they can do? And how is it that they can appropriate it within their own work? Do you think that that is one of the challenges in giving and receiving feedback in both your experiences? What have been some of these challenges in both giving feedback as educators as well as for students who are receiving the feedback?
So Melanie, you would like to start first?
Sure thing. Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm a high school teacher in Seattle, Washington. So I'm not sure what the schools are like in India, but I have 150 students. And one of the challenges that I faced was just practical. Like I was taking home huge stacks of papers every single day. And I found like it was impossible. I knew that feedback was the most important thing I could do for my students, but I found that it was impossible for me to like sit down and give them all timely feedback. Like it would take me weeks. And then by the time that they get it, it's no longer relevant. And the other challenges was around even when they received the feedback, like they would take one look and then throw it in the trash. So I had a real issue with like, how do I actually help my students read the feedback and understand the feedback that I give them?
So definitely, yeah, one of the challenges is timely feedback is something which all educators struggle with when they're teaching so many students together, so many people together. And the third one, the second is adding to that is that as Melanie had said something, it's very important while we give the feedback. The challenge is how do they receive that feedback? How do they use that feedback for their improvement or for their growth? These are two which are quite a few challenges while you're looking at some of the challenges of giving and receiving feedback.
Absolutely. Some other very interesting challenges coming up in the chat as well, where one particular one which stood out to me was how sometimes more than the students, it becomes difficult to provide parents with an understanding of the kind of feedback that you've given their own child. So that also, I'm assuming that at some point in time in today's session, we will be talking about some of those kinds of challenges as well, and how sometimes teachers also find students are not receptive to feedback. They find that feedback is perhaps putting them down in some way, or not appreciative enough of the effort that they made towards a task or towards an assignment or towards anything that you were doing in the classroom. So some very, very crucial aspects already being highlighted. One in terms of the process of a student's improvement and how feedback factors into that process, and also in terms of making students or preparing students or readying them to receive that feedback and act on it. So with that, I think we've established the grounds of today's discussion, and I'd like to now open this out to Mrs. Sandhir and to Melanie to take over and to talk us through what they'd like to be talking about today and bring to light some important aspects around feedback and what are some of the things that we can do to improve our feedback practices. So over to you, Mrs. Sandhir and Melanie.
Thank you, Pallavi. And we'll start with the first slide, which is, so John Hattie, he is a professor of education. And I'm beginning with John Hattie's research, which is very important, who's done a lot of research on what feedback is and what is the power of feedback. So he's from New Zealand and he's a key proponent of evidence-based teaching. So what exactly is evidence-based teaching? Basically, it is to teach using only those methods which have been verified from evidence to be effective. He actually led a team of researchers, and many of you may be knowing about it, otherwise you can research about him, that who conducted multiple meta-studies about the effectiveness of different teaching interventions. According to him, he said everything works in teaching, but what are the things which have an influence or which impact or which have an influence which he calls effect and etc. on student achievement. What are the interventions which have a major impact on student achievements in school? So if we can go to the next slide. So if you look at this, with all these databases that he did with his meta research and meta sites that he conducted, all the research that he conducted, he created a formula to quantify each influence, which he called effect size. So I'm not going to go into technical, but to just tell you that he classified all these influences in 4 zones. Below 0, 0 to 0.15, and 0.15 to 0.4, and then greater than 0.4. And according to him, everything else, as I said before, works. But what is important is to understand what influences higher achievement. And he said that the strategies that are above the effect size of 0.4 will have a stronger impact on students' achievement. As Hattie, he says that schools and teachers must evaluate the impact of their effect on student learning. So the impact is all the strategies, and in the next slide, I'll take you through some of the strategies that we have looked at. These are, in fact, he has researched on every single strategy, and you can, if you go on net and find Google's John Hattie's research, you'll be able to look at all the strategies and how effective they are. So if you can look at here, success criteria, for example, is a high impact strategy. Praise is a medium impact strategy. If you're using FaceTime and social media in your classes, it's a low strategy. Similarly, feedback is 0.73, which is a very high impact strategy. So this shows how important it is for your students' growth. Feedback is a very important aspect. If we can move on to the next slide, what he said then was that when this research was conducted on feedback, it was found that all of us give lots of feedback. And I've seen many teachers, sitting and spending time writing lots of comments and giving lots of feedback and to the students. But it is not about how much. They found in the research that 1/3 of this feedback had a negative impact on students. Also, something that is effective for one student may not be effective for another. Just looking at it, for example, marks and grade, and Melanie talked about it just few minutes ago, where you must have found that the students look at their marks. It has happened with me in my classes when I mark the students and I give them marks, and I write a word next to it, excellent or well done, and keep doing it, whether for a formative assessment or for a summative assessment. I do not see the students. They just look at the mark, and that assessment is put inside their bag, which they don't go back to it again. They do not look at what were the areas which they did not perform, or what were the areas which they did very well. So if you go into the next slide, and they are not able to evaluate how they need to move forward. So if you go on to the next slide, this is very truly, it speaks about that if you give comments only, when we give students the grade, the learning stops. You are not able to give them specific feedback and an extended question to make the learning deeper. So when you give comments, it's just 30% gain. But if you give them grades and comments, that also is about, you get mostly this 25%, there's a positive impact. But if it's only comments, then there are 30% gain, and it's shown as positive impact. And as we go forward in the slides, I'll tell you that feedback is a process. It's just not one-time comment or one-time mark and comment. Can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. So this was Hattie's model, feedback model, which relates to 3 feedback questions. Where am I going? What is going to happen now? What success can I expect as a result? And these are the questions that if I look at, it's feed up, where I'm going, how am I going, where to next. So if I talk about feed up, where am I going? So what is going to happen now? What is the success can I expect as a result? So at this stage, it is important when you begin with the process of feedback, it's important to describe the outcomes. It's, you know, generally in a class when we are giving say a lab report or an essay for them to write, sharing rubrics or sharing what should your essay look like, what are the important points that essay has. It's important to give a success criteria at the end of the unit. It's not good to give them that in the it's not good to give them only at the end. It's what, give them the outcomes, describe those outcomes in the beginning. If I succeeded this, what will I have learned? What will be the product or essay or artwork look like? That whole planning of the outcomes should be given in the beginning. Then it is about how am I going? And when you talk about how I'm getting on, am I on track? You have to you have to speak to as the student on track to succeed. What did go well? What errors or mistakes they have made, and how do you correct them? And this feedback is relative to the success criteria. It's based on the success criteria. Where are you along the progression? And it's during the process. Many teachers at times wait for the child to complete the work and then give their feedback. This feedback should be given around when they are working on that process. And then the third question is feed forward, which is where am I going next? If I've learned what else, once you've given the process feedback to them, once you've given them about how am I going, then after the work is completed, where am I going next? What do I have to do next? How do I build up a deeper understanding? What is and what is not understood? How do you can give them enhanced challenges. There are students who do very, very well, and they may do a perfect work for you. But how do you give them enhanced challenges? Where do they need to move next? It's all about the growth. Then the feedback is, it can be about 4 areas: task level, process level, self-regulation level, and self level. So I'll just briefly talk about this model for you. Is this task level related is the most common feedback that we give. It generally relates to a specific criteria within a task. For example, the task was to measure all the 3 sides of the triangle. It is, and you did not measure the third, you measured only the second. It's also known as the corrective feedback. The second one is the process, whereas it is used to complete the task, this is very essential. As we have said that earlier, am I using the tools correctly about the process? This is much more effective for deepening the learning. The process is more effective for deepening the learning. This generally relates to the process of learning, reassessment of the approach. If you've been using some approach to complete your task, reassessment at that point, thinking of some alternative strategies. So that is what it works very well. Self-regulation task is the third task, which comes from monitoring their thoughts and action. When they self-regulate their own feedback, it helps to enhance their self-evaluation. When they look at their own work or they evaluate their skills, when your students self-regulate their own learning, they'll become more as independent learners. So it's a very high order, I would say, kind of feedback, which you train the students to give when they give self-regulation feedback. Self-feedback is something which has a negative impact. When you talk about praise, if you talk about, am I wonderful yet? Do I feel wonderful? Have I been praised enough so that other things I'm wonderful? Or you say good or excellent. It becomes more personal and it has a negative impact, and this on the learning. So it should be, as far as possible, avoided, because feedback should be about the work that students have done. So this is little briefly about the model of feedback, and we'll talk more once Melanie takes over and takes it further. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Hi, thank you. So all of the information that Ms. Sandhya has shared is really important. Feedback has been shown to have a high impact on student learning based on research. And I always struggled with this idea of giving information to students and making sure that it was well balanced in all the ways that Ms. Sandhya talked about. And this is a definition that I used to think about with feedback, and I saw also some other teachers did too. And in building Floop, we have talked to hundreds of teachers who had the same opinions about feedback, thinking about feedback as just information on how to improve and, you know, where they can be going and how to get where they need to be. But if we think about feedback as just the information itself, we're really missing out on the other aspects of feedback that are so important. How do we actually help feedback have the impact it can have on students? So when we dived into the research, we learned that researchers actually have a different definition of feedback that is more similar to what we started with in this conversation around feedback is a process. So here is a new definition of feedback. Need to get in. Is feedback is the process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. Just to build off of what Ms. Sandhya was talking about, the information can be given at any of the task levels. So it could be task feedback, it could be related to their process, it could be related to their self-regulation. And the information can come from a lot of different places. It doesn't need to just come from their teacher, it can come from their peers, and it can come from themselves, it can come from their family, from mentors. The process of feedback is just making sense of all of the information they're getting and using it to improve and to grow. So when we think about feedback more broadly as a process and not just as information, then we can think about what are the aspects of feedback that I've been missing out on. And Floop has defined effective feedback to be composed of these three parts. One of those parts is the information itself. It is the information that's coming at them when it's still timely and relevant, and it's specific, so that they can actually take action and learn from that feedback. So this part at the top is the feedback information itself. The second part of effective feedback is the student's agency to act on this information. Ms. Sandhya mentioned the study by Ruth Butler, where they compared 3 different kinds of feedback and grade combinations, where comments only were shown to improve student work, whereas grades and comments, grades alone and grades and comments both, did not really impact student work and learning. And she shared how, because at the very end, when you put a grade on something, it shows finality, and the students don't go back and they don't look at it. In essence, when you are putting a mark on something, it kind of removes that agency to act for a lot of students. They don't feel like there's anything they can do with that information. So agency to act and giving students agency to act can look a lot of different ways. It can look like withholding the grade and having a conversation about the feedback. It can look like revisions where students go back and they revise their work. It can look like them going back to the same concepts, like maybe you're doing an essay, you know, this month, and next month you're going to do another essay, and they want to take the information forward with them. But somehow giving students agency to act, this involves you thinking critically about your curriculum and how would you structure agency to act during the process. Somehow students need to have a reason to use feedback information for them to actually feel like it's worthwhile and to grow from that feedback. Now, the third element of effective feedback is one that I am most excited about, and I also feel like it's most overlooked. And this is the challenges around, like, why aren't they receiving my feedback? Sometimes they take it too personally, they're sensitive to it, sometimes they don't read it. There are skills around feedback that every person needs to develop. Like, we all as adults have probably developed feedback literacy in some point in our lives, but it often is not explicitly taught to students. But just like a growth mindset, just like other kinds of literacy, feedback literacy can be taught and should be taught and developed. And we can think about feedback literacy as just the skills and know-how around feedback. It includes everything from how do you emotionally prepare yourself to receive feedback, how do you give quality feedback, how do you receive feedback, and then how do you process your feedback and use it to learn. These are all elements of feedback literacy. So this was a big change for me, thinking about feedback not just as information itself, but thinking about feedback more broadly as the process of learning, making sense of information and learning. And this process includes the information, the ability to act, the agency to act on that information, and then the feedback skills themselves, called feedback literacy. So at this point, well, we wanted to pause and make sure we could answer some questions.
Yes. Yes, super. Melanie, lots of interesting questions coming in, and I thought I'll just direct these to you and Mrs. Sandhir. The first one was about, and I found this particularly interesting because I think that this is something that we as educators are extremely mindful of, that we don't want to put the kid down or be extra critical or negative or in some ways negate the effort that the kid has made. We want to encourage them, we want to praise them also. So should feedback always be positive? And if we want to improve a student's performance, what are some ways of making that feedback constructive?
Sure, I'll jump in here. So that's a really interesting point about like positive versus negative feedback. And there's a relational element to feedback too, where you want to build a relationship with students through feedback. So I'm actually gonna like take another angle to this question. That is that, like Mrs. Sandhir said, the feedback process should start with identifying what the learning outcomes are and what the goals are. And when you're anchored by like, this is the goal, then you can take away the emotional aspects, more of the emotional aspects of feedback, and that it's not positive or negative anymore. It is only observing and evaluating where you are based on the learning outcomes that you want to achieve. So as long as you have a strong framework up front about like, this is what we're trying to go for, this is where you are now, it should be, as much as possible, feedback should actually be removed of this is good or bad. It shouldn't be judgmental, but instead it's just observational, and you're helping to guide them towards the learning goals that you might have already established.
Absolutely. I love your use of the word observational, Melanie, because I think that that is so important when we think about feedback. Instead of thinking it as something which is negative or a critique, or even perhaps, in some ways, a negative, response to something that didn't go as planned or as expected, it's important to simply bring to the students' notice what they've done. Versus what they may have done or could have done. And that observational lens, I think, is so crucial for us to have as educators. What do you think about that, Mrs. Sandhir?
So I'll just add on to, so well said, this, learning goals or the success criteria, if it is shared before and you use that, the student looks at it, what you call, which you term as, and I don't, I also agree totally with Melanie and Pallavi, that it's not about negative feedback, and the students perceive it. If you develop a culture that this is an area of growth and improvement, what you call as negative, if it is used with the success criteria or the learning goals, if you take that as a base and you relatively, and you give feedback based on that, the students perceive it as their area of growth or area of improvement, and they don't perceive it as negative. Basically, when we do not work out the learning goals, or when we do not work out the success criteria, it is at that point when student is not aware that they look at it in that term as what you call it as negative.
Yeah.
So,
and another interesting thing that tends to pop up is, and this did come up in the chat as well when we opened up the session, was about how do you go about, what are some of the ways in which you can actually develop this culture of trust, or this culture of thinking of feedback as growth as opposed to criticism? How do we go about doing that?
Absolutely. So something which we are going to talk in our slides further is something, and that's very, very important. So I think in our slides further, I am going to be briefly talking about this, that how do you develop a culture of feedback? How do you do that in the classes? And that's also very, very important for the teachers, that when you are modeling, when you are giving a feedback and you're modeling that in front of your students, it if you are giving you're making feedback personal rather than feedback on the task, that's what your students are going to learn. So it's important to model and focus and emphasize on your feedback on the task when we are doing it. For example, good, but if you say, okay, good work done, but if you emphasize on what exactly was that work, good work done, or like being a maths teacher, if I say that, okay, good, you've been able to understand say one of the sessions of how to add or how to problem solve, it gives the students an idea that I'm not talking personally, because students tend to get mixed up, and you're building a culture of modeling about feedback is I'm just talking about the task that the student has done.
Yeah.
So modeling is a very important aspect. It starts with the teacher for building up a culture of feedback.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to share a couple other strategies too, one of which is just to talk about feedback and feedback literacy. So Pallavi, I'll share a video with you later, but we created a quick video that teachers can use to introduce students to the concept of feedback literacy, but like putting a word on it, just in the same way that we put words on growth mindset, putting words around feedback and feedback literacy can help students just be aware that this is a conversation, this is important, this is something we're going to talk about, it's an important part of this class. Identifying and being upfront about the fact that feedback is emotional, like to the best of our ability, we're going to try to remove judgment from our feedback, but it doesn't help the fact that feedback is emotional, and being open about that. And just like Ms. Sandhya mentioned, modeling is so important. And this includes not only modeling effective feedback processes for your class, but also modeling the process for students of taking feedback, processing that feedback in front of them. Being vulnerable in front of your students will go a long way in showing students that it's okay. If you take a course survey, instead of just like putting it out there and then reading the results on your own, processing those results with your students and saying, hey, this was really hard for me to hear, but this is going to help me. And that's why, I'm doing this too.
Absolutely.
So thinking about,
it's so important for you to also be able to show that kind of openness and willingness to develop that space of trust and sharing with your student, where they also feel comfortable to receive something from you in terms of how they can do something better. So on that note, we'll pause the questions here for a quick bit, and please keep the questions coming in. We'll keep taking them as we go along. And passing this back over to you, Melanie, and to Mrs. Sandhya to take us through the rest of what they'd like to share with us.
Okay, next. Yeah. So some of the questions that you asked, I think the main question, how do we build that process of feedback in our class? So something which Melanie also talked about, and I'll begin with, there are basically eight steps, because first part, which I've put in bold, that the other 7 steps do not work if you have not worked on the first step, which is creating the culture. So before beginning the steps to this feedback, you'll need to build a culture of trust, engagement, support. And some of the things we shared previously in our talk, that how do you build up, Melanie talked about, a very a lovely term which I've taken up from here is feedback literacy. And that's very important to build up before you start this process. And modeling is another one, which I'll talk about a little bit more with you. And it's both ways. You should be able to model that you are also open-minded. You also ask students to give you a feedback. Participative feedback is processed from both the sides. It's not only from teacher to student, but from student to teacher. So without this, otherwise all these steps will be rejected by the students. And high quality feedback will also influence the culture positively. In a way, culture also influences the feedback. So it's both ways. If you start your process of feedback in your class, you will develop a process of culture of trust, engagement. If students start taking feedback from their peers, you are actually developing, feedback is helping you to develop a culture of trust and acceptance and being open-minded. So first part is you agree on learning goals, which also Melanie and I both spoke about it. Is the first part is to start the 7-step feedback is by agreeing on the learning goals, which is your success criteria or your learning intentions. For example, if you create on Pythagoras theorem, what are your learning goals on Pythagoras theorem will be? What are the learning success criteria for a student to understand Pythagoras theorem completely, or how to write a lab report, or for the younger students when they are painting a picture. If you write, say, tell them that you focus on 3 things, use the whole page, use at least 3 colors, or experiment with mixing different colors together to see what new shades can be created. So these are 3 things which are the success criteria for drawing a picture. Once the students have completed their first attempt on their first draft, which is your draft, this is after you've done the learning intentions, then they should engage in a round of self or peer feedback. And this peer feedback, I'm going to talk more about it, that how do you develop a culture, what do you mean by peer feedback, and how it should be brought up in your classes. And after the peer feedback is done, they should then make additions or corrections and not redo the whole work. They should add on, and there are ways which they should edit their work based on what they peer, or if they have given their feedback on their to the whole. After this completion of step 1 to 4 is when the teacher gives a systematic feedback, is given by the teacher, and this feedback is how to further improve their piece of work based on, again, the learning criteria or the learning goals that you've given. Students then edit it the last time and hand it over and complete their work. And if required, then you can grade this work. But this is a whole process of doing it. Or at the end of it, if you want, you know, there are some teachers who would like that, okay, this is where we've given them feedback and then they have understood and they have written this piece of work. You could have a small quiz or a summative assessment at the end of it. But this is a whole process of working out on a feedback, where you can very clearly see the steps of feedback culture, all the 7 steps of feedback. It enable you to actually work on actually help the child to grow and give you a piece of task which he has fully understood. Somebody in the question and answer session and asked, you know, what is about this process? So actually, how many times the teacher should give a detailed comment? So actually, if you look at, the teacher is only commenting after the 4 areas, when they have finished the, you know, the 4 points, after the student has got his feedback from the peers, and then he's edited. It's after that the teacher comes in. So this is very important. The next slide, please. So now I'm just focusing because it's difficult to go more in detail about other things. The time is short, but I thought I'll talk about building, supporting peer feedback. And as we talked about, building classroom culture is very important. If you are enabling your peers to do, you know, you're asking for, have peer feedback as a kind of process regularly in your class, then first part, as we said earlier as well, it's very important in our previous slides as well, that it's important to build a classroom culture of trust. That's the first part. Otherwise, peer feedback will not work. It will become personal. You need to train your students to give feedback on tasks. So modeling, where modeling is the one way which you can, you know, share this, and where you share a piece of work which has been assessed by you and using the success criteria, and you can share that with everybody and you can discuss it with everybody. So this is one of the ways in which you can bring in the feedback literacy. You teach your students how to give feedback. Then there are feedback protocols, and you teach them to use those to teach them to give feedback on tasks using success criteria. For example, 2 stars and a wish is something very, very basic which you can start with, where they look at a piece of work and they have to give 2 stars, which is appreciation, and one area where constructive criticism, constructive criticism on how, what they can do to make it better. The next is practice feedback. It is allowing students to practice giving feedback. This is a very important aspect where you should allow the students to give feedback, and then you know, the teachers should mark the students' feedback. Once you ask your class to mark each other's feedback, the teachers should comment on that feedback so that the students learn how to give feedback. Sometimes, for example, there is an excellent work given by, and many times your students will come and say, oh, this work is perfect. But a question for forward, okay, what will you do to make it epic? So these are some things which you guide your students how to make, how to practice, or how to better the feedback strategies. Once this has happened, once your students have learned and mastered the art, some of them would, some of them won't, but some of them, when they learn how to give feedback, it is a great way to build student agency by empowering your students to be experts. I know many teachers have shared where they would have a group of students, because you've built up the trust, you've created engagement. Please, this will not work in case you've not built up the first 4 points. And then you can have experts who will give feedback. So this is a very good example of student agency when you empower students to be experts. Next slide, please. So these are some of the peer feedback protocols which I thought I'll share. There are many, but I picked up just few of them to share with you. I spoke about this plus minus next. What's next is where students comment on what was done well, pluses what was done well, point out minuses, point out a misconception or a misunderstanding, and next is suggest a strategy. The 2 stars and a wish is suitable for those who are very new to peer feedback. Students are paired up to write 2 positive comments and a suggestion or a constructive suggestion about another student's work. Then you have praise, question, suggest protocol. This helps the students to see the strengths of their work, consider questions and suggestions that will lead to improvement. Now, it's not easy for students to question. So this is once they are comfortable with peer feedback, this is the time when you can use the praise, question or suggest protocol. Then you have the tag protocol, which is an excellent peer critique technique for writing work or essays. T is for tell the writer. It's something like the previous one which we did, but it is quite good for your writing work or essays. You tell the writer something that you like, or ask the writer a question, or give one piece of, for G it is give one piece of constructive criticism. So these are some of the protocol. Gallery walk, I'm sure you must have done when students put up their work on their walls, and each student can give feedback using any of these protocols to comment on student work and the work done by the other students. So these are some of the peer feedback protocols that you could take up and use in your classes. Melanie, next to you. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. So we're going to start diving into some of the tools that we can use for feedback, and the ideas behind the tools you can apply in, whether you're using technology or not. So these same protocols, the ideas, the strategies still apply, but it can certainly be helpful to have tools available to speed up the process for you, to enable remote or hybrid learning, especially in this environment right now. So that's why we're going to start diving into tools, starting with Floop, the tool that I created. And Floop was my answer to my feedback struggles. And I met a bunch of other teachers, including my co-founder, who were having the same issues and wanted to not only help teachers give meaningful feedback faster, but actually build student agency and feedback literacy around the feedback process. So we created Floop. It's an app that helps teachers give meaningful feedback faster, but unlike other assessment tools, we use research-based strategies to actually help students learn from their feedback. Students submit their work through the website, and teachers leave feedback 4 times faster. Students can act on their work through dialogue and revision, and they also engage in scaffolded peer review that's specifically guided to build feedback literacy. So I'm going to dive into different aspects of the app and how it can support a 7-step feedback process or whatever process that you're using in your classroom for feedback. So Ms. Housekeeping shared some awesome strategies around peer feedback, and Floop has a protocol built into the app, so it will help guide students through the process just by using it. This is from the student perspective. Once students have submitted their work, then you can run a peer review on that assignment. And a student gets put into this dashboard where they see an anonymous peer student work on the left, and then they answer a series of questions about the work on the right. So the way that we structured our peer review is around a single criteria. And the research shows that focusing peer review, or any kind of feedback really, but focusing peer review around a single criterion will really help them develop and focus their feedback. Students have experience with engaging with the success criteria over and over again. And then they start to be able to see their own work in that light too, as they keep on engaging with the criteria and evaluating work against that criteria. So as a teacher, you can set up this criteria in advance with your students, and then you make it the focus for your peer review. And students, the first question that they answer is, how much do you agree that this task meets the criteria? And they either say, I completely agree, I somewhat agree, or I don't agree yet. The next few questions guide students through other aspects of peer feedback. The first question is around observation. What do you see in the work that supports your opinion? And that one is simply observational, what are their notes? Then there's how might your peer improve on the criteria, and what would you like to celebrate about the work? So as soon as students submit their peer review, they are sent to another peer's work, and this can continue on until they've given feedback on 4 to 5 pieces of work within a 20-minute period. It's double-blind anonymous, so that students don't know whose work they're seeing and they don't know who's giving them feedback. And this is to also help remove some of the emotional aspects of feedback. So as a teacher, though, it is not anonymous. The teacher is able to monitor the peer review in real time. So over here we have, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like stoplights, for example, but green light means you're good to go, yellow, slow down, red, stop. So we've used the same color conventions over here, and at a glance, I can tell that Christine, I might need to stop and intervene with her and check in with her sooner, because it looks like 2 of her peers think that she's not yet meeting criteria. Gabe's work might be a good example. He has 1 green, 1 yellow of an exemplar that I can then show to students and walk through how this is meeting criteria in certain ways. So at a glance, I can see real-time data from my students around how the peer review is going. I'm also able to click in on any of these dots and read the feedback specifically, so I can help evaluate how well students are giving feedback to each other in the moment. So that's just a bit about the peer feedback that we use. And again, it's ideal that this process happens early on before teacher feedback is given. That might not be realistic in all cases, but that's the ideal. And you can always run a peer review after teacher feedback or anywhere in the process as well. So in addition to peer feedback, you can give teacher feedback on the same work. And the way that it happens is it's very similar to giving feedback on handwritten, assignments when you turn in paper assignments, where you might try to leave comments on the paper. The difference is that you have a lot more space to do so. You just type the comments, and you can click and type and leave a comment anywhere. But as you leave the comments, they get added to a comment bank. And I know for sure, like, I felt like my hand has been falling off from just writing the same comments over and over again. So that's where the comment bank come into handy, is you can just drag and drop the comments anywhere onto the page and reuse those comments. And the information that we get from that is how much am I giving the same kind of feedback, and what kinds of misconceptions does that show? So in this engineering assignment that I'm doing, where students have to evaluate and give write down what the user flow is for using a toaster. My top piece of feedback is around like, hey, you're not actually talking about the toaster here. And now I can recognize that this is a misconception that my students have, is really identifying the product and not other aspects of the system. If you want to reuse comments from previous works, you can, let's say you're giving assignments and essays, and you tend to give the same kind of feedback on essays, you can just reuse and you can pull those comments from a previous assignment. From a teacher's standpoint, both the digitizing of work and the leaving text comments and then dragging and drop comments really speeds up the feedback workflow. From there, every comment opens up a conversation thread. So this is how students can act on their feedback through dialogue, is they can click on the comment and then leave a reply, and you can have a dialogue around the feedback itself within the app. And then lastly, the students can resubmit based on feedback. This is currently the first version of the work, but if Ryan, in this case, were to submit another copy of the work, he would, it would appear over there. And as a teacher, I would be able to see all of the previous versions and all of the feedback attached to those versions. So I would be able to track how well they've been receiving the feedback and making improvements based on feedback. And if necessary, there's a spot for you to leave a grade as well. So that's how Floop can help support teacher feedback. And again, it's ideal when this can happen after a round of self or peer feedback. But there are times when you just need to go in and like quickly look at work or leave some comments. This can happen for any piece of work at any point in the process.
So I'll add on some more tools for feedback. I just wanted to, I saw lots of questions and who looked at before we come to the tools of feedback is about Melanie, where they looked at the 7 steps of feedback and they found this is too time consuming. I just wanted to add that it's basically creating a culture of feedback. Once you've done that peer feedback, like I'll just give you an example. For example, you can, tag feedback can be used in 3 minutes. You ask your peers to use tag and give feedback and give them 3 minutes on a piece of work that students have done. But it's the time consuming part is building up a culture. And that's very important. The using the feedback process is giving a peer feedback or using peer feedback and then the teacher's feedback is not so time consuming. So Floop is absolutely wonderful. I have personally used it and I think it's a fabulous tool for teachers. Specifically, I used to find it very difficult, to mark at exact places. And I remember using it where you can actually picture a work, even your handwritten these days. We have, what I did was I took a handwritten note and where I could, as you can see this here, which Melanie has said, the thing that we struggle with is that many times we give children to handwrite the work and they can take a picture and quickly you can mark it on. So Floop is a fabulous tool and I think I encourage everybody to use that. I've used it personally and I find it very, very useful for a feedback process. So some of the other tools that you can add on and which many of you may be doing it as, but I thought I'll bring it, is encouraging students to give or even you giving voice feedback on OneNote. If you all have got OneNote book, this thing, it has a voice feature which you can use it both for teacher feedback and also for student feedback. I have marked my students' notebooks online and I've given them, I found it very tiring to write down for every, so I would record my voice and the children loved it and they could play back anytime that they wanted. So it was voice feedback. Flipgrid, if you're using Flipgrid, then using a video for peer feedback or feedback from any other audience or a teacher is also an excellent tool. One of the teachers shared with me how she used screencasts and I found that was brilliant. She was marking an essay online and she recorded that as she was explaining, highlighting the various points in the essay and used a screencast for recording that. So that's another very good tool. Seesaw is a tool which you use for portfolio. Again, has a feedback process, is a great tool for giving them feedback on Seesaw. Google Slides, I think, is fabulous. If you can, Google Slides and Google Docs are fabulous collaborative tools. We've used them very often in our classes where students can, comment on each other's work. So these are also great tools for feedback purposes. So thank you.
Super. This has been so amazing, so enriching. So, I mean, it's just mind bogglingly opening to think about all the different things that actually go into something like feedback. Something that would, how is it that one small comment on a student's assignment can actually make a world of a difference in the way in which they perceive their understanding of the work, as well as how when they interact with the work done by other students, how their understanding of their own work improves and increases. So I think that's such a brilliant process to actually build into our own classrooms. And there are some very interesting questions that have come up just in the last couple of minutes. So I know we're almost running short of time. So we'll just take these last 2 or 3 questions. The first one is to do with early years. And I thought that we should address this here because that really is the time when we start inculcating the culture of giving and receiving feedback. So how do we develop this language of feedback, especially with the tiny tots? And I'm going to leave this open to both Melanie and Mrs. Sindhi. If you both have strategies that you might like to share on how this language of feedback can be developed.
Ms. Sandir, you work closer to that age group. I work with high schoolers. So.
I also work with middle schoolers, but early years, I know that some of the protocols that you use, for giving 2 stars and a 1 wish, and, just getting the children even to draw a smiley, or this is what you like, this is what you did not like, and modeling first by the teacher and then asking students to put it, small things where you give them smiley stickers and give them some stickers which they feel they need to work on, and talking to them why. And I've seen some wonderful work done by early years on how they build up this strategy of 2 stars, 1 wish, which they are using in their classes for encouraging the children to give feedback. So I think these are some of the things which I have told you, and you can watch. In fact, there are lots of videos which I think primary teachers use a lot of peer feedback. They build that in the students when they encourage the students to give this kind of feedback.
If there's one video that I would recommend, that everybody who wants to understand how to actually demonstrate to students, I think we both know what we're going to be.
Austin's butterfly.
Austin's butterfly.
Yeah,
I think that's
absolutely
become a benchmark. While we do have issues around that video. It's over the years, various people have responded to that video in various ways. But I think that the most important message that this video, and I'll put it down in the chat for those of you who might like to watch it. It's called Austin's Butterfly. And you can YouTube it. It's available on the internet, free and open to everybody to see. This video actually showcases how a teacher demonstrated to their students the importance of giving feedback, and how feedback actually helps improve the work of one of their peers, and how those students collectively were able to, with the guidance and the prompts provided by the student, they were able to help that one student improve their work and their drawing of that butterfly. Mm-hmm. So what I think we could all try and do is, there's no hard and fast rules around developing that culture. Like Mrs. Sandeep was also saying, there are various things that go into developing that culture. When we want to start small with the kids, modeling is a great way of going about doing it. How you give feedback to students on their work, regardless of what age group they're in. They're watching you, they're observing you, and they will try and adopt these practices in their own feedback at the time when they're giving their own feedback as well. So especially for the primary kids, is extremely important.
I do want to... Yeah, please go ahead, Melanie.
Oh no, so there is one specific resource too, in addition to the Austin's Butterfly video, which is awesome. There is a picture book called Thanks for the Feedback, and it is specifically for younger audience, and in introducing ideas around feedback and feedback literacy. So I would recommend that book called Thanks for the Feedback.
Super, and we will remember to put these things down in the in our email when we send it out to all of you as well. Just one last question, I think, before we leave. There was a question around. I'm sorry, I had marked that somewhere. Just give me one quick second while I look for it. Yes, how does when we're giving students when we ask students to give one another feedback, how do we ensure that the feedback that is given is is
Not,
appropriate,
not it.
not negative, it's not condescending, it's not demeaning? How do we do that?
So I'll, and then definitely Melanie can add on to it. I spoke about the culture of feedback. You have to train your students. It's a skill. Before you straight away get into, you have to train the students to give feedback on the work and not personal. And that's a whole training which takes place through modeling, through, giving them success criteria. There are various ways in which you train the students about how to do it. And that's very, very important. If you just go into the class after you've heard this, the webinar, and you say, okay, I want to use this strategy, and I ask the children to give this feedback, you have to model those for them before the children start doing it, so that they understand that it is, I'm going to comment on the work. The kind of questions that you use for taking their feedback should be about the task. And the student will automatically, you'll find, will answer those questions. If it is on the task, using those questions, the student will not become personal. So those are important things. Melanie, you may like to add to this.
No, absolutely. I agree with everything you said. Like, having protocols really helps, and anchoring the work around certain criteria really helps to keep the feedback more neutral. In addition to that, modeling the feedback goes, in the same way that you might show examples of great student work, you can show examples of peer feedback to the class too, and have open conversations about, like, what was helpful about this feedback, what might not be helpful about this other piece of feedback, right? Showing examples of feedback is another great way to try to keep, to help improve feedback for your peers, and to keep it less emotional.
Super. That's great. And with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. I wish we could continue this conversation. There is so much more that we could still talk about. And I can see that we still have questions coming in, and we apologize that we might not be able to answer these. If you'd like to leave these questions in on the Facebook group, we'll stop by and try and respond to them once the session is done. But on that note, I do want to thank Melanie and Mrs. Sandhir for the time and their wisdom and their tips and their strategies. And thank you so much for opening up this wonderful conversation around feedback and the importance of it, how crucial it is for students to be able to receive and give effective feedback, as well as for teachers. So thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Mrs. Sandhir, for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
And
Thank
you
you
so much to the participants for all these wonderful questions, and for asking and keeping this conversation open, and sharing all of your views in the chat as well. Thank you so much for joining us in today. We will be sharing the recording with all of you. Do remember to sign in on Friday for another interesting session. And we look forward to being in touch and to communicating with you and keeping conversations around effective teaching and learning open on our social media platforms. So thank you so much for today, everybody, and have a lovely week ahead. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Bye. Bye. Thank you. Bye.